I was halfway through my second cup of diner coffee when the fortune cookie fell out of my pocket. I'd swiped it from a takeout bag the night before, forgot all about it, and now it skittered across the formica like a tiny comet and landed in the sugar caddy. This was at Lou's on Congress Avenue in Austin, the kind of place where the napkin dispensers squeak and you can tell the time by the waitress's size. I cracked the cookie because why not? Monday, no plans, summer leaning hard through the windows. The fortune said, in the thin blue font of cheap promises, turn left today. I laughed, because what else do you do with a bossy cookie? But when I paid my bill and pushed through the jangly glass door, I actually did it. I turned left instead of right, away from where I usually walked, and into heat that felt like opening an oven to check a stubborn cake. 2 blocks later, I found a sign taped to a lamppost that said, "Free Maps," arrow pointing down a side street. The arrow looked hand-drawn, impatient. I had nothing better to do and a soft spot for cardboard boxes with the word free on them, so I followed it. The side street was a quiet scene behind a row of vintage stores, the air faintly smelling of leather and dust. There, under the shade of a shoe repair awning, sat a banker's box stuffed with folded city maps. The kind you used to get from gas stations, bright, crinkly paper with cheerful fonts. A sticky note on top read, "Left over from Dad's glove box. Please take." I picked one at random, Amarillo, and another, Madison, Wisconsin, and one more, Asheville, North Carolina. The whole stack was a road trip that already happened to someone else. I should have kept walking. Instead, I opened the Asheville map on the spot, listening to the slow droning of an air conditioner somewhere above my head. In blue ballpoint, near the French Broad River, someone had drawn a small star. Next to it, "Ask for Alma. Be kind." The handwriting had a steady patience to it, like the note had been written by someone who believed in maps and in people. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket, along with the fortune. Then I carried the Amarillo and Madison maps back to my apartment to see if they had stars too. They did. Amarillo had a tiny heart near a long-closed diner and the word "listen." Madison's star sat on the edge of a lake with the instruction "wait." I put the 3 of them side by side on the kitchen counter and felt a small, ridiculous current run through me. The way you feel when the vending machine gives you an extra candy by mistake, and you take it as a sign of cosmic favor. These were someone's private directions scattered in public. It felt like reading the margins of a stranger's book. By the time the sun started to look tired, I had found 6 more stars across 6 more maps, each with a verb. Ask, listen, wait, trade, return, apologize. The verbs were tender and a little old-fashioned, like pocket knives that had been sharpened for years. I tried to imagine the dad whose glove box held so many cities. I pictured hands on a steering wheel, elbows browned by sunlight, a theme song of unknown stations. There was an invitation hidden in the ink. By dinner time, I'd talked myself into a plan. I would visit at least one starred place. Not to pry, and not to play detective, just to see if the map could loosen something in me I didn't know was tight. The closest star to Austin was the one in Asheville. It was far, but not impossible. I found a cheap flight for Thursday, texted my boss a polite request for 2 days off, and promised myself I wouldn't turn this into a quest for answers. I just wanted a good walk, a cup of coffee, and the feeling of being the kind of person who follows a handwritten star. On Wednesday night, I packed light. A pair of broken-in sneakers, a paperback, the Asheville map, and the fortune cookie slip, which I slid between pages like a fake bookmark. The sky over my apartment glowed the color of wet cement. I watered the fern I always forget to water, then set an alarm and lay awake with that jittery feeling that comes right before travel. I thought about Alma, the name by the river. It sounded like a bell and a grandmother and a school nurse all at once. I decided I'd be kind, even if that meant buying a coffee for a barista who didn't want to talk, or leaving a generous tip with no conversation, or simply not rushing the day. When I finally slept, it was thin and light, like I didn't want to waste any darkness on dreams. The plane was nearly empty. The man across the aisle wore a shirt that said, "Sunset is a daily reminder," and I took it as permission not to roll my eyes. I watched the braided rivers of Tennessee slide by under a lace of clouds. At the Asheville airport, the rental car clerk handed me keys to a compact that smelled faintly of spearmint and ambition. The map, unfolded on the passenger seat, looked suddenly fragile. I drove toward the river with the feeling that someone had nudged my shoulder at just the right second. I parked near a small park where joggers moved like determined metronomes and old men in caps argued about nothing on a bench. The star on the map aligned with a narrow storefront painted teal. In the window, a handwritten sign announced Alma's Fix-It. Underneath, "If you loved it once, I can fix it twice." My heart climbed into my throat in a way that was embarrassing and human. I pushed open the door, and a bell chimed, and the shop smelled like oil and linen and wood glue. Somewhere in the back, a radio murmured. I stood there, stranded between curiosity and decency, and said hello to the dust motes as if they were the ones I'd come to see. A woman stepped out from behind a curtain, wiping her hands on a clean rag. She wore gray overalls and a pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked like the kind of person who keeps promises long after other people forget. I told her I was just looking, which wasn't a lie, and she nodded once, the way you nod to a skittish horse. The shop was crowded but orderly, lamps waiting for new cords, typewriters with keys like small teeth, a plain wooden chair that had been braced with brass so beautifully it felt like a lesson. I wandered to a shelf where a cluster of alarm clocks leaned against one another like tired cousins. One of them had the same face as the clock that sat on my grandmother's dresser in Florida, the one that always lost 7 minutes by Saturday. The radio in the back tuned itself to a clearer station and a guitar line came through. Simple, round notes that made the air feel warm. The woman watched me watch the clocks. I don't know why I pulled the map from my pocket. Maybe because it was already open in my chest. I smoothed it on the counter and pointed to the star by the river. Up close, the ink looked older, a little faded. "I found this," I said, and then I said the words on the paper, lightly, like I was testing how they sounded in the room. "Ask for Alma. Be kind." The woman looked at the map, then at me, and pressed her rag into a little folded square as if she were tucking in a child. "I'm Alma," she said, like it was both an introduction and a confession. The bell over the door made a lonely sound as it settled. I felt myself lean forward a degree, as if gravity had shifted, and I realized I had finally arrived at whatever this whole thing wanted from me. The fortune cookie in my book at the hotel, the sticky note on the box, the verbs in blue ink. All of it had led to a small shop with teal paint and a woman who fixed things that other people gave up on. She didn't ask how I found her, which felt like a kindness I didn't deserve. Instead, she tilted her head toward the shelf of clocks. "Pick one that reminds you of something," she said. Her voice had the kind of calm that comes from long practice, the stubborn peace of a person who has decided not to rush. I pointed to the clock that looked like my grandmother's. Alma nodded, then turned the clock around and opened its back with a small screwdriver. "These fall out of time," she said, "but they can be coaxed." She adjusted a bent coil, dabbed a touch of oil that smelled like new pencils, then closed the back and set the hands to noon. She wound it once, and the little heartbeat started up, steady and eager, as if happy to be remembered. "There," she said, and slid it across the counter. "Tell me what you're apologizing for." My mouth went dry. I hadn't said anything about apologizing. But apologize was one of the verbs on the other maps. and I realized suddenly that maybe the verbs weren't instructions for places at all. Maybe they were the private index of a life. What you do when you don't know what else to do. I told Alma I wasn't sure I was apologizing for anything, but the words sounded thin, like a curtain you could see light through. I thought of my younger brother in Arizona, the way I hadn't called him back last month when he sent a photo of his new apartment, beige walls, and a window that looked like it wanted to be a door. I thought of a friend in Madison I'd labeled flaky because he'd missed a birthday dinner, and how easy it had been to nudge him to the edge of my life and let him hang there, fingers digging into the ledge. The clock on the counter ticked like a kind metronome. I said I might be apologizing for time. "That's a good start," Alma said, and I thought it was the gentlest sentence I'd heard all year. I asked her about the maps. She wiped a smudge of grease from her palm and said they were her father's, a restless man with a soft voice who kept paper cities folded beside the coupons and the tire gauge. After he died, she sorted his things and found the marks he'd left, stars, verbs, a breadcrumb trail through a country of small kindnesses. He'd been the kind of person who pulled over for roadside fruit, who learned the first names of toll booth attendants, who returned stray dogs without calling it an errand. The stars were notes to himself, she said. If he ever found his way back to a place, he wanted to remember how to be there. She'd put the maps out for anyone who might need them because that's what her father did, over and over, gave away what he had that made sense to him. He had this theory, she said, that we don't need instructions for big moments. We need them for the little ones, when your hands don't know where to rest. I stood very still. The clock hummed in my palm. Through the window, a woman walked past with a paper cone of roasted peanuts, and the smell drifted in, sweet and something like November. I asked if I could buy the clock. Alma shook her head. "Borrow it," she said. "Bring it back when it's done what it needs to." She put it in a paper bag stamped with the shop's name and drew a star on the top, not as a promise, but as an anchor. On my way out, I turned back and told her thank you, which felt flat compared to the air of the room, so I added, "Be well," and she smiled the way you do when you realize the person in front of you is trying. Outside, the late afternoon had that lazy, golden stretch that makes every sidewalk look like a photograph from a good year. I drove to the hotel with the clock riding shotgun, its tick louder than the radio, like a cricket that had opinions. I ordered a burger and ate it in bed. The clock sat on the nightstand, counting me back into myself. The next morning I woke before the alarm and lay there listening to the small engine of borrowed time. I thought about the verbs again. Ask, listen, wait, trade, return, apologize. They sounded less like instructions and more like a way to travel without moving. I opened the paperback and the fortune fell into my lap. Turn left today. I laughed quietly in the empty room and put the paper in my wallet. I made a list of people who had been the recipients of my silence, which turned out to be a longer list than I wanted. My brother in Arizona, my friend in Madison, my neighbor in Austin who'd left a kind note about my packages and I'd never thanked properly, my father who always asked about my car because it was easier than asking about my heart. I didn't feel like a bad person. I felt like a person who needed a better map. I took the clock to a coffee shop and set it on the table. The barista slid my mug across the counter and said he liked the sound, that it made the place feel like a kitchen. I told him it wasn't mine and that I was trying not to keep it too long. He smiled like he knew what I meant. After coffee, I walked along the river, the map folded in my back pocket, and called my brother. He answered on the third ring, voice full of desert sunlight. I told him the clock story because facts are easier than apologies sometimes, and then I told him I was sorry for being slow to show up. He said there wasn't anything to forgive, but I heard the ease in his breath when he said it. We talked about his apartment, the window that wanted to be a door, the way the wind at night smelled like a new idea. When we hung up, the river looked less like a boundary and more like a road with shimmering lanes. I flew back to Texas that evening, the clock wrapped in a t-shirt in my carry-on, the map folded like a letter I could read while waiting for boarding to begin. On the plane, a toddler in the row ahead of me stared backward between the seats with the gaze of a tiny judge. I made faces. He awarded me a solemn nod. Back in Austin, the heat hugged me like a relative with no concept of personal space. The fortune stayed in my wallet. I slept like I'd paid my tab with the day. The next week, in the soft pocket after dinner, I carried the clock across the hall and knocked on my neighbor's door. She opened it in socks and a sweatshirt, and I thanked her properly for looking out for my packages, and I handed her a slice of lemon loaf that I had baked with the impulsive confidence of YouTube. She laughed and said the universe usually sent her brownies, but she was happy to diversify. The clock ticked on my palm like it approved. The days grew into themselves. I called my friend in Madison and told him I had misfiled him in my head and I wanted to fix the folder. He said he had done a little misfiling of his own, and we talked about a game of pickup basketball we might never play, and it was perfect in the way plans that never happen can be. I started dropping off small fixes at Alma's store in Asheville through the mail, loose screws taped to an index card, the plastic foot from a chair, a note about a lamp with a wobbly sole. She sent back instructions in her neat hand, as if we were pen pals in a class about patience. The verbs kept working on me like water on a stone. I tried trade, which turned into swapping my Saturday morning run for a volunteer shift at the community tool library off Cesar Chavez. I tried wait, which meant letting a conversation with my father last past the first silence. The clock lived on my dresser and seemed to keep time a little better each week, as if it, too, was practicing. In early fall, the city let out a sigh. The air stopped trying to prove a point. One evening a flyer appeared in my building's lobby for a small repairs night at the library. Bring your broken things, no promises, lots of goodwill. It was printed in a cheerful font that looked suspiciously like hope. I pinned the flyer to my corkboard and stared at it the way you stare at your own handwriting and wonder if someone else wrote it. I emailed the organizer, a librarian named Dom who signed messages with a tiny hammer emoji, and offered to help. He said absolutely, bring pliers and good shoes. When I arrived that Thursday, the room buzzed like a beehive dream. Lamps with no light, radios that had gone quiet, a hinge that squealed. Dom handed me a name tag and a bin of mismatched screws, and I took a breath that felt like finding the correct key on the first try. People lined up with objects they loved. A woman in a denim jacket brought a music box that played the first 4 bars of Edelweiss, and then gave up. A teenager arrived with a skateboard that rattled like an apology. A man in a suit presented a stapler with the solemn air of someone introducing a dear friend. I didn't know how to fix most of it, but we were not alone. A retired electrician named Mateo showed me how to test a lamp cord with a multimeter. A grandmother named Ruth tightened the world one screw at a time. A college kid named Perry quietly cleaned a coffee grinder until it remembered beans were not gravel. The room swelled with the small bravery of people asking for help. I kept thinking about Alma and her pencil and that curtain of patience behind the counter. Midway through the night, a woman about my age stepped up with a clock. It looked like mine's cousin, the same round face, the same stubborn tick turned silent. She said it had belonged to her mother and hadn't worked since the move from Dallas. She smoothed her thumb over a nick in the brass rim as if the clock might purr. I turned it over and opened the back. Inside, the coil had unhooked itself and a tiny screw rattled like a seed. I heard Alma's voice in my head. Coax, don't pry. And I tried. 10 minutes later, the heartbeat started, tentative, then proud. The woman's face opened the way the sky does after a thunderclap. She didn't cry. though I think we both wanted to. She asked what she owed me, and I said the price of admission, which was free. She laughed and slipped a folded note into the donation jar anyway, then surprised me by pulling a map from her tote bag. "I collect them," she said, almost apologetically. "Old ones." She unfolded a map of Arizona that smelled like sun-baked pages and put it on the table. Someone had drawn a star just north of Tucson. Next to it, in blue ballpoint, a single word, "Call." I didn't know whether to sit or stand. The room kept moving. The stapler got a second chance. The skateboard found it smooth. I stared at the star on the map and felt the shape of my brother's number in my pocket, the familiar geometry of 7 digits that had stubbornly remained the same while my attention had drifted. The woman with the clock smiled and said she'd picked up the map at a yard sale in Tempe years ago, thought the star was charming, never thought much about it. I traced the word with my eyes. The verbs were following me, or I was finally standing still enough to see them. I folded the map once, then twice, and the woman told me to keep it. She said she had dozens, and besides, it looked like I needed that one more than she did. I slipped it into my back pocket, where the Asheville map used to live, and felt the gentle weight of coincidence settling into something that wasn't coincidence anymore. By closing time, the donation jar was heavy with 1s and 5s, and the floor was confettied with wire clippings and victory dust. Dom clapped his hands and announced we'd resurrected 22 objects and given strong counsel to 5 more. Everyone cheered the way people cheer for the small, quiet miracles that add up to a bigger one. I walked home under a sky so clear I could see the hole the moon leaves in it when it's not there. The Arizona map pressed a rectangle against my jeans like a polite secret. In my apartment, the clock on the dresser ticked with its modest pride. I sat on the edge of the bed and dialed my brother. He answered with a yawn that sounded like a smile. We talked, really talked, about the corridor at work that made him feel like a shadow, about the plant he was trying not to kill, about how he missed our grandmother and how, sometimes, he thought he heard her clock scolding him for being late to his own life. I told him I loved him, which felt better than an apology because it required less agreement. After we hung up, I walked to the dresser and wound my clock exactly once, as if I were winding a watch I wore inside my chest. The next morning, I wrapped the clock in the same paper bag from Alma's shop. I wrote a note that said, "Thank you, borrowed time returned," and drew a star, then packed it carefully in a box with enough padding to protect both brass and sentiment. At the post office, the clerk asked if there was anything fragile, liquid, perishable, or potentially hazardous, and I said only the part about the fragile, and kept the rest for myself. On the sidewalk outside, I checked my wallet for the fortune and found the space where it had been. I pictured it falling out somewhere between the coffee shop and the river weeks ago, sliding into a crack, or maybe catching a ride on someone else's shoe. This didn't bother me. I didn't need the instruction anymore. Turn left had already done its job. In the weeks that followed, I started marking my own map, the city I knew by muscle and guess. A star by the library, because that was where people brought the broken things they were not ready to abandon. A star at Lou's Diner, for the good coffee and the blue light of morning and the way the waitress refilled my cup like an apology she didn't owe me. A star at the Tool Library, where Mateo and Ruth and Perry and I learned over and over that most things aren't ruined. They're just waiting for patient hands. I didn't write verbs. I remembered them. I stood in line behind the man who counted his change twice and decided that waiting wasn't a delay but a practice. I returned a book I loved to a friend I loved more. I asked for directions less often with my mouth and more often with my attention. One evening, I received a small box from North Carolina. Inside was the paper bag I'd sent, folded flat. Alma had drawn a new star on it and written, "You kept better time than most." There was also a note on an index card in that neat hand. Next time you come through, bring the clock that lives in your pocket. She didn't sign it because she didn't have to. I held the card for a long minute, thinking about how many times I'd been given back more than I thought I'd mailed. I walked to the window, watched a couple argue gently over whether the sky was purple or pink, and decided both could be true for a while. The city hummed like a well-tuned engine. My life made the small, sturdy sounds of things working. I still keep one map in my backpack. Sometimes it's Asheville, sometimes Arizona. Sometimes it's whatever I pull from the stack I keep by the door, a scatter of paper cities that smell like gas stations in summer. The stars are less like destinations now and more like reminders that kindness is a route you can take even when you don't know the street names. When I feel lost, I sit on a bench or at a counter, and I listen the way people listen when they believe there's something worth hearing. The other night, at Lou's, a kid accidentally knocked over a salt shaker and looked like he might cry. I handed him a napkin and said it was okay. His mother mouthed thank you. The waitress refilled my cup without waiting for me to ask. Somewhere far away a river kept going, patient as a repair. I finished my coffee, set a tip under the saucer, and turned left out the door, not because a cookie told me to, but because left put me on the shady side of the street, and I wanted to carry my cool a little farther into the day.